I'm Lei from BullishBooks, and I want to start today with a question that might be a little uncomfortable. Think about your manager, or maybe a previous one. Is that person actually effective? Not busy, effective. Because those two things are very different, and I think most of us have worked for someone who proved that point perfectly. My boss schedules meetings about meetings, and nothing ever actually gets decided. My manager takes all the credit when things go right and disappears the moment something goes wrong. My boss is always impossibly busy, and I genuinely cannot tell you what they're busy with. I heard variations of all of these during my years in academic research labs, and what struck me every time wasn't that these managers were lazy or checked out. Most of them were intelligent, hardworking, genuinely knowledgeable in their fields. They cared, and yet they were producing almost nothing that mattered. That gap between effort and impact is what today's episode is about. We're going to dig into why smart, hardworking people often produce so little, and what the most effective people do differently. By the time we're done, you'll have a concrete set of practices you can start applying this week, whether you run a team, manage a project, or are building something entirely on your own. Let me be upfront. None of this is about personality type. It's not about charisma or some innate gift. It's a set of learnable disciplines, and that's actually the most useful news I can give you, because it means this stuff is available to you right now. Let's start with something that genuinely surprised me when I first thought it through. Effective executives look nothing alike. They range from extroverted to nearly reclusive. Some are warm and generous, others are cold and demanding. Harry Truman, widely considered one of the most effective chief executives in American history, was famously not a charismatic guy, and yet he reshaped post-war American foreign policy more decisively than almost any president before him. So effectiveness isn't a personality trait, it's a set of practices, and the ones that matter most can be distilled into 8 things. Effective people ask, what needs to be done? Not, what do I want to do? They ask, what is right for the enterprise? Not what's politically safe. They build action plans from those answers. They take personal responsibility for decisions and for communicating them. They focus on opportunities rather than problems. They run productive meetings, and they say we rather than I. Notice something about that list. The first 2 questions generate knowledge. The middle ones turn knowledge into action. The last 2 make the whole organization feel accountable, not just the person at the top. Jack Welch didn't walk into GE asking what he wanted to build. He asked what needed to be done, and the answer was cutting every business unit that couldn't be number 1 or 2 in its industry, even profitable ones he personally liked. That's a hard call, but it's the kind of call that comes from asking the right question first. Now here's something I want you to sit with before we get into the specific practices, because this reframed a lot for me. The environment most of us work in is structurally designed to make us ineffective. Not because organizations are poorly run, but because there are 4 specific realities built into organizational life, and unless you actively fight them, they will grind you down. The first one, your time belongs to everyone else. The moment you carry any real responsibility, your calendar stops being yours. Your boss, a direct report with a crisis, a colleague who needs 5 minutes, everyone can walk in and take a piece. If you don't manage time deliberately, the organization will consume all of it. You'll end every week feeling like you worked constantly, but accomplished almost nothing you actually intended to. Second, you'll keep doing your old job unless you stop yourself. There's a gravitational pull toward what you were good at before. The scientist who becomes a lab director and still wants to run experiments. The salesperson promoted to VP who keeps personally working deals. This isn't nostalgia. It's what the flow of events will drag you toward if you don't redirect deliberately. Events don't tell you what's important. They tell you what's urgent. Those are very different things. Third, your effectiveness depends on people you can't control. In any organization, your output only matters when someone else uses it. And the people most critical to whether your work lands are usually lateral or above you, not your direct reports. If you can't make your contribution relevant to peers and colleagues across the organization, you're largely ineffective, regardless of how hard you're working. And fourth, you see the inside of the organization, but results only live on the outside. Every real outcome, every customer served, every product that lands, every goal achieved lives in the external world. But what's visible to you is entirely internal. Reports, meetings, internal dynamics, politics. The higher you go, the more your attention gets pulled inward. I watch this happen constantly in research environments. Brilliant scientists would become administrators and progressively lose touch with the actual science because managing the internal machinery consumed everything. These four realities can't be eliminated. They're structural features of the job. But knowing they exist is the first step toward not being destroyed by them. So what do? Let's start with time, because this is the one resource you cannot buy, borrow, or recover once it's spent. Most productivity advice starts with planning. I've come to think that's exactly backwards, because planning assumes you already know where your time goes. Almost no one does. Our memories are unreliable narrators about this. I've tested this on myself more times than I'd like to admit. I'd have a confident sense of how I'd spent a week, and then the actual log would tell a completely different story. The writing I thought I'd done a lot of turned out to be a few fragmented hours. The email that felt like background noise had actually consumed 2 mornings. The practice that changes this is almost embarrassingly simple. Keep a real-time log of where your time goes for 3 to 4 weeks. Not what you plan to do, not what you remember doing. What you actually did, recorded as it happened. Once you have that data, you ask yourself 3 diagnostic questions. First, what on this list would absolutely nothing happen without? Things that leave no trace when dropped entirely are pure waste. And almost everyone has more of them than they think. Second, what could someone else handle just as well or better? If you're spending time on things others could do, you're not spending it on what only you can do. And third, this one stings. What am I doing that wastes other people's time? In my research lab days, I watched senior scientists call everyone into a room to discuss things that directly involved only 2 or 3 people. 8 people, 1 hour, nothing decided. The scientist running it genuinely thought it was useful. It wasn't. After trimming, the goal is to consolidate what remains into large blocks. Real work, the kind that actually moves something forward, doesn't happen in 15-minute fragments between interruptions. It requires 90 minutes to 3 hours where you can actually think. A report that needs 6 hours of focused work doesn't get written in 12 30-minute sessions. It gets started 12 times and finished never. Now let's talk about the shift that I think is the most disorienting and the most valuable. It's moving from thinking about activity to thinking about contribution. I used to ask people I worked with a question I adapted from this framework. What do you do that justifies your being on the payroll? The answers I got were almost always descriptions of activity. I manage the sequencing pipeline. I coordinate between the wet lab and the computational team. What almost nobody said, and what I had to consciously train myself to say, was anything about results. Not what I do, but what changes because I'm here. What decisions get made better. What the organization can do tomorrow that it couldn't do yesterday. The shift from activity thinking to contribution thinking means turning your attention away from your specialty and toward the performance of the whole. It means asking not, am I doing my job well, but is this organization better because of what I'm producing? Every organization needs 3 kinds of performance from its people: direct results, the measurable outputs that justify the organization's existence; values reinforcement, a commitment to what the organization stands for and why, without which you start optimizing for the wrong things; and people development, building the human capacity to perform tomorrow. An organization that can't reproduce its own competence is already declining, even if it looks healthy today. This reframe also changes the quality of relationships at work. The teams I've seen operate with the most trust and the clearest communication were almost always oriented around a shared output they cared about. Warm feelings are nice, but productivity comes from people who understand what they're collectively trying to produce. Let's talk about one more idea that I think is genuinely counterintuitive: building on strength rather than fixing weakness. I spent years in environments where the implicit performance model was identify your weaknesses, develop them, become more well-rounded. Annual reviews reinforce this. Feedback conversations reinforce this. The whole apparatus of professional development was built around the assumption that the goal was a person with no significant gaps. The problem is that model produces mediocrity. Not because self-improvement is wrong, but because it optimizes for the absence of weakness rather than the presence of strength. Those are completely different targets. Strong people almost always have strong weaknesses. The most incisive analytical minds are often terrible at reading a room. The most creative thinkers often can't execute. The best operators often struggle to imagine anything they haven't seen work before. Peaks and valleys come together. Lincoln spent 3 years appointing generals to lead Union forces based on who had the fewest obvious flaws. He got 3 years of stalemate despite overwhelming material advantages. Then he appointed Grant, a man with a known drinking problem and a personality that rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. And the war turned. The question was never whether Grant had weaknesses. The question was whether Grant could win campaigns. He could. The practical takeaway: ask, what can this person do exceptionally well, before you ask, what are their limitations? The limitations are always there. The question is whether the strength is relevant to what you need, and whether the weaknesses directly interfere with it. And for your own development, the question isn't, what am I bad at, and how do I fix it? The more useful question is, what am I genuinely good at? And am I in a position where that strength is actually being used? Now, priorities. How do you actually decide what comes first? The people I've watched accomplish the most almost universally share one habit. They concentrate. They pick one thing, give it their full attention, finish it, or get it to a stable resting point, and then move to the next. This sounds obvious, but watch how most people work. 7 ongoing projects running simultaneously, constant context switching, a lot of motion with not much forward progress. Doing one thing at a time doesn't mean accomplishing fewer things. It often means accomplishing more, because each thing actually gets finished. Progress compounds, and you spend less energy reloading context on a dozen half-finished projects. The harder question is, what's actually first? A few things I found useful here. Pick the future over the past. Resources and energy should flow toward what comes next, not toward defending what already exists. If you're holding onto a project primarily because you've already invested in it, not because it's where opportunity lies, that's a signal to drop it. Ask yourself regularly, if we weren't already doing this, would we start it today? If the answer is no, it belongs on the stop doing list. And treat opportunities as higher priority than problems. Problems are loud and demand attention. Opportunities are quiet and disappear if you don't pursue them. Most organizations spend the vast majority of their time and talent on problems, and almost none on opportunities. The imbalance is almost never noticed because problems are urgent and visible in a way that opportunities aren't. I want to close with something I find genuinely useful regardless of where you sit in an organization. The word executive sounds like it only applies to people with corner offices. But the real definition is anyone whose decisions significantly affect the performance of the organization they're part of. By that definition, a senior individual contributor qualifies. So does a researcher deciding which projects to pursue. So does an independent creator deciding where to focus their output. And even if none of those fit where you are right now, these practices aren't really about organizational power. They're about making the most of the time and attention you have. Know where your time actually goes before you try to manage it. Ask what you're contributing, not just what you're doing. Build on what you're genuinely strong at. Concentrate on one priority at a time instead of managing a portfolio of half commitments. The honest version of this, and I want to be clear about this, is that I don't always practice any of it well. I drift. I let the urgent crowd out the important. I spread my attention too thin and wonder why nothing seems to move. These practices aren't a fixed state you achieve. They're a direction you keep correcting toward. But the underlying question, am I spending my time and attention on what will actually matter, is one I think is worth asking more often than most of us do. If any of this resonates with you, I'd love for you to go deeper on it. Head over to BullishBooks.com, read the full article, and think about where the biggest effectiveness gap is in your own work. Is it time, priorities, something else? Drop a comment and let me know. If you found value in this episode, please subscribe. It genuinely helps more people find the show. I'm Lei from BullishBooks, and I'll see you in the next one.